I want to thank Sashi and the Apex Group for inviting me and making me feel at home here today. I must confess I first met O.V. Vijayan as a young PhD student, sitting in Ashish Nandi's room. And it was quite interesting to watch them because Vijayan was concerned with the fate of a young man. And Vijayan said instead of being concerned with ecology, this young man was more worried about Disneyland. And Vijayan wanted to know from the psychologist Nandi what to do. His concern was fascinating. And I want to say that today's lecture is a set of footnotes to Kasak. Because I think Vijayan, more than anyone else, taught the importance of the storyteller. And in fact, I can give you 3 examples where ecology needs storytelling. The first of it came when a friend of mine sitting in Orissa met a young tribal in the mining areas of Orissa. And the tribal turned around and said, "Today a waterfall died, a myth died, a way of life died." And I was quite stunned by the expression of this. So I went back to Delhi school and I gave this presentation till an economist, and economists aren't very literary, said, "Waterfall? That's only so many cusecs of water. What are you mourning?" The same kind of thing happened when I was sitting once with the philosopher Ramu Gandhi. We were watching the Narmada struggle, the last stages of the struggle. And then Medha Patkar said, "We're losing. But what we're losing is the story." And Ramu Gandhi turned around and said, "That is the sadness of Narmada. Not only did a story die today, the storyteller died with it. A memory is gone." And in fact, the event that prompted Ramu to say this was, Medha came and said, "The army has moved into the last villages of Narmada." And a soldier goes up to an old man and says, "Baba, chaliye." And the old man says, "I can't move." The Jawan says, "We're giving you new property." And the old man says, "It's not about property. It's about memory. My ancestors are buried here. I can't leave." That sense of story is, I think, what O.V. Vijayan gave, linking ecology and Marxism in a new and fundamental way. So what I'm going to do is today try an interesting experiment. For a few minutes I was sitting with a group of literary critics and literary figures, and I was feeling very proud, and I suddenly asked myself the question, what if the first row of literary writers were a part of the Constituent Assembly? What if novelists, not lawyers, not scientists, not politicians, were part of the Indian Constituent Assembly? Would things have been different? And I want to ask this question in a different way, because I remember one of the people who really impressed me a lot was Mahashweta Devi. And I remember she asked me to write an introduction to her short story, The Pterodactyl. It's a stunning story. It's about a starvation in Bihar. And a young journalist goes to investigate this because he hears suddenly that an ancient bird has come to a cave. And the tribals are excited by it. The journalist, very secular, very modern, goes to the cave. And he discovers, to his surprise, a pterodactyl. Something which everyone thought was extinct for 50 million years. The pterodactyl is dying, smelling. But the young tribal sits next to it and says, "My cousins have returned." The journalist is stunned. As a modernist, as a secularist, as an evolutionist, he can't understand. And then he suddenly says something fascinating. He says, 50 million years separate me from the tribal and the pterodactyl. They are kinsmen. They belong to a community I don't belong to. And I remember Mahashweta saying, this is the problem. Evolution can't be a science. it has also to be a myth. It has to be an act of storytelling. It has to be a structure of kinship. Time and again you get this throughout. Because I think one of the things we are confronting today in India, with the death of marginal groups, with the decline of nomadic communities, with tribals losing their way of life through the destruction of the forest, is the end of storytelling. Literature becomes a form of trusteeship. Storytelling becomes a form of memory, where we, to a certain extent, keep these tribes alive. But the promise is different. I think the promise was put brilliantly by Ananda Kumaraswamy when he said the national movement must not museumize its people. Kumaraswamy, in fact, asked, if God were to return today and ask civilized Western man where the Aztecs, the Incas, or the Australian Aborigines were, would he take him to a museum? A museum smells of death and formaldehyde. Storytelling has to have a sense of the seeds of the future. Kumaraswamy, in fact, wanted an anthropology of storytellers. And I think this is really what Vijayan actually said. Because if you look at it, Vijayan wrote Kazakh at a time when Marxism was the dominant ideology. And in fact, to a certain extent, lampoons it in the book. But I think what Vijayan was trying to say is, beyond the mode of production, is the mode of imagination, is the production of fantasy, magic. It needs a different language. And it's this search for the language that makes Kazakh such a fascinating book. I wish the Constitution Assembly had read Kazakh, because in a way it brings back the sense of fairy tale, the sense of magic, and it gives you a different kind of representation. A constitution that has a place for Kili is a different kind of constitution. It is actually representational because it takes into account fantasy, depression, a certain kind of disadvantage, and builds it into the part of representation. So what I'm going to do today is a literary exercise. I'm going to pretend the first row is a part of the Constituent Assembly. How would literature change the Constitution? We know how law would change the Constitution, politics would change the Constitution. And I want to begin this as an exercise. Just taking 5 facts and 5 terms into account. First, cosmology. Second, constitution. Third, commons. Fourth, citizenship. And finally, civilization. Let me begin each with a certain kind of story. I think recently, one of the most exciting things that happened was when New Zealand declared a river to be a person. When the river became a person, it acquired rights. The BJP, in its ham-handed way, tried an imitation by declaring the Ganges as a person. But by the time the BJP had finished with the Ganges, instead of sounding like a river, it sounded like a PWD department. How do you bring the literary? How do you bring the sacred back into the imagination? And I think that's one of the most stunning things. Because remember today, it's very strange. When social sciences talks about secularism, scientists are talking about a return to the sacred. I remember meeting Isabel Stengers, who used to work with Ilya Prigozhin. He said, what science needs most is a sense of re-enchantment, a sense of mystery. Because science without that sense of mystery is no longer science. It becomes a drab objective science. And the whole thing about the recovery of biology and quantum is a movement towards re-enchantment, a movement towards the sense of the sacred. And it's in this context that I really want to propose something. It's something first which a theologian told me, Raimundo Panikkar. And Panikar suggested the Indian constitution cannot be literary. In fact, it even cannot be literate till it's in multiple time. Raimondo and Ivan Illich used to work together. And Illich, in fact, argued that a constitution in developmental time is genocidal by definition. Because the constitution in genocidal times believes in progress. And if you believe in progress, there is no place for the tribe. There's no place for the peasant. There's no place for marginal groups. Development is by definition genocidal. And only literature can rescue it. Raimondo, in fact, proposed the idea of chirological time, where past, present, and future coexist. I remember I wrote a paper for the Constitutional Reform Committee saying that the Indian Constitution is in linear time. If it was to be truly literary, it will be in multiple time, because multiple time allows for a multiplicity of storytelling. Justice Venkatachalaya, who read the paper, called me and said, "Young man, please come back 100 years later." Maybe literature is futuristic. Maybe literature tries to capture a kind of memory we have not yet understood. And maybe literature doesn't take its responsibilities seriously enough. Let me push it just a bit further. What if we were to make nature today part of the Indian Constitution? What if the preamble were to begin, "We the people now recognize nature as a part of the Constitution"? That's what Kasak says. Because the minute you bring nature into the Constitution, you break the standard Judeo-Christian idea of nature as a resource. And not only pluralizing Christianity, you pluralize religions. Because once you make nature a part of the imagination, the Constitution by definition is less genocidal. And I think this is the first thing we have to do. You can't really talk about the Narmada Dam, you can't talk about Chipko, till you in a deep and fundamental way return nature back to the Constitution. If Vijayan's Kasak says anything, is that nature is a part of the imagination. Nature is a part of the mode of production. Nature has to be constitutional. Because it's only as a constitution that you can actually enter into the formal structures of the imagination. But I think Vijayan went further. I think what he wanted to emphasize was our culture is not just literate, it's oral. And India today needs a new contract between the oral, the textual, and the digital. Our society is oral. We are a group of storytellers. As citizens, we survive on rumor and gossip. We survive on storytelling. And yet, the government of India introduces a genocidal step by defining language only as a form of life which has a script. That day you destroyed 2,000 oral languages. You reduced the tribal to silence. Orality has to be brought back into the Indian Constitution because orality contains the seeds of memory. A constitution which has nature and a constitution which has orality has notions of memory. In fact, it's one of the paradoxes, as one of my scientific friends would say, that the more information society we get, the more amnesiacal we become. Memory and information are at cross purposes today. Because memory comes in discrete bits, as bytes, as information. But the old notion of memory was a memory of context, the memory of storytelling. In fact, in a deep and fundamental way, we need the storyteller to return to the Constituent Assembly. A simple proposition. Anyone who has read the Constituent Assembly debates is actually stunned by its silences, by the absence of Gandhi. The Constitution has no storyteller. It has historians. But historians are official creatures. The silences, the nuances, the play of language, the act of storytelling is missing from the Constitution. I was just visioning, what if Vijayan had written a novel on the Constituent Assembly? The possibilities are fascinating. I think there's something more fundamental about language. And I think it was brought to me brilliantly when I was in a conference in America. And I was sitting next to a great American botanist and a great authority on traditional knowledge, Wes Jackson. And I began my lecture by saying, the beauty of Indian diversity is rice. And I've talked about the fact that we have 150,000 varieties of rice today. 150,000 varieties of myth, dreaming, and cooking. And I remember Madhav Gadgil telling me, science can't save rice in India. Only myth and storytelling can. Because it's only myth and storytelling that can sustain the diversity of 150,000 varieties of rice. And then, of course, I made a mistake by Sunday saying, America is a high information society. And Wes Jackson got up in the middle of the audience and said, idiot. I said, what happened? He said, you don't understand. India is a high information society, not America. Because America reduced its apples from 166 to 6. Monoculture is the destruction of storytelling. Monoculture is the destruction of diversity. Just take a simple example. Take the coconut. If you were to open an economic botany book, it will be described as palm yielding oil. And next to it, I read an anthropologist friend of mine who listed 232 uses of the coconut. 232 varieties of imagination. And I think that's what storytelling does. And diversity is crucial today. The Enlightenment models have talked about liberty and equality, but have forgotten diversity. And diversity needs memory. And a friend of mine, a botanist, in fact, once told me a beautiful story about the dodo. It disappeared 200 years ago. And as it disappeared, a huge tree disappeared. All the samples of the tree disappeared within a few years. And this young New Zealand botanist was puzzled by the relation between the disappearance of the tree and the disappearance of the bird. And then he did a bit of investigation. And he found that the dodo would eat the seed, swallow it in his gullet, wear out the ectodermis so the seed could germinate. So the botanist immediately goes, catches 2 turkeys, feeds them the seeds. And within a few weeks, the tree is reborn again. Memory becomes a subtle part of science. And I think what Vijayan did in Kazakh is to create a tribute to memory. Marxism needs a theory of memory. And ecology provided it. Because ecology has a sense of diversity. A different kind of storytelling where history goes beyond the historical narrative. It can summon myth, it can summon orality, it can summon storytelling. But I think as important as nature is that storytelling has to return to recover the body. And here I want to make a difference between nationalism and the nation state. When you talk of nationalism, you talk of literary figures like Tagore, Gandhi. But these were nationalists who were against the nation state. Nationalism was peaceful. But India as a nation state is based on 2 of the greatest genocides of history. Partition and the Bengal famine. Partition claimed 2.3 million people. The Bengal famine destroyed 3.6 million people. You add it up, our genocide ratio is as close to the Nazi camps as you can think. So India is a country that began in violence. India is a nation state that began on the basis of 2 genocides. But who talks about the Bengal famine today except a small group of storytellers? The Bengal famine is forgotten. 3.5 million people die, and there's no memory for them. There's no mourning wall for them. And it's in this context that Ramu Gandhi once suggested that every time a species dies, every time a language dies, every time a craft dies, we should have a mourning wall, where instead of talking about soldiers who died, we talked of species which die, of languages which die, of crafts which die. And this question of memory came out in a very interesting way recently, last year, when a group of craftsmen at Chirala talked about weaving with the Max Planck Institute. Max Planck had sent some of its greatest historians of technology. And suddenly the weavers did something strange. The weavers got up, 2,000 of them, and told the scientists, "You've stolen our theory from us." The scientists were stunned. And they said, the first thing you do is break this division between the podium and the floor. Come and sit with us. And at that moment, a friend of mine who was a weaver had a brilliant idea. He brought in 40 looms into the exhibition. And the weavers, as they started weaving, not only wove silk as cloth, but wove theory and storytelling as a part of technology. And I remember one of the weavers scientists telling me later, it was one of the most moving moments of their life. Because for the first time they discovered, weaving is not just a technology. Weaving is memory. Weaving is storytelling. Weaving, in fact, in a way, is frozen literature. In fact, this Chirala conference has now led to the revival of indigo in a systematic way in India. But there's another reason for it. The amount of people who are disappearing in India without a story is stunning. Every time there's a disaster, every time there's a cyclone, marginal fishermen disappear. In fact, it began with Bhopal. I defy any of you to tell me how many people died in Bhopal. Because the government lied. For every graveyard where it said one person, it actually buried 4 or 5 people. The government lied. But that lie has a certain structure. It shows that disasters allow for indifference, for obsolescence. Try another simple thing. Forget Bhopal. I don't think any of you can tell me how many people are retrenched by the IT industry in India every year. It runs to thousands. Thousands of IT engineers become non-persons, but no newspaper will ever report their story. People are disappearing. Livelihoods are being destroyed. Technologies are erasing them, but we have no storyteller. And the storyteller, in fact, becomes the new trustee of the Constitution. And the storyteller never speaks in one language. Because I remember you are Ananthamurthy once telling me, and it began in a certain context, when suddenly one of his friends came up to him and said, "Do you know Bertolt Brecht has performed more times in Malayalam than in German? Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage has been performed more times in theaters in Kerala than in Germany." And Ananthamurthy turned around and said something brilliant. He said, truth to be true has to be true in 2 languages. Brecht is truer in Malayalam. I think that is the fascination of language to me. And that's why I think the author is a trustee of culture, is a custodian of memory. And that's why I wish the Constitution had a better sense of storytelling. Because it's storytelling that sustains the rights of a people. Let me push it further. Take a simple thing. I think one of the things we face today is the threat of the expert. Ivan Illich, in fact, coined a word for it, iatrogeny. It first began in medicine, where the medical expert is the source of illness. Today, development is iatrogenic. The economist as expert is the source of genocide. Of course, we put him in the planning commission, that's separate. How do you challenge this? And I think it's in this context that we need, let's put it simply. Any theologian will tell you, economics does not have the language of suffering. A cost-benefit analysis has no sense of memory. How do you create an economics of suffering which understands what the tribal has been subject to, what the nomad has been subject to, what informal economies have been subject to? Economics has no language of suffering. It has the language of growth. It has the language of progress, but it has no evaluation of displacement, of suffering. India must be the most ironic constitution in the world, where we began by saying dams are the temples of modern India, and dams today have displaced 66 million people. That means we have displaced through development more refugees than from the wars we have fought. But we have no memory of it. Kazakh is a celebration of memory. Kazakh is a celebration of the fact that the mystical and the magical are required to sustain language. Language cannot be purely secular, it has to be polysemic. And I think this is really what I'm trying to drive at. And now I come to the last part of my essay. I think the biggest crisis facing us today is that the revolutions we talk about are not revolutionary enough. The Darwinian revolution, the Copernican revolution, the Freudian revolution, the Marxian revolution, all of it did displace man. But it didn't tell us that we were a part of the earth, that the earth is a part of our cosmos. You need a poet or a myth like Gaia to tell you that man has destroyed the earth, that man is trustee of the earth, and yet we also know in a deep and fundamental way that the earth can outlive man. The Anthropocene is an understanding of the damage that man has done to the earth. And the Gaia hypothesis is a recognition of how man can redeem the earth. And yet it's strange. When Jim Lovelock met his neighbor, William Golding, who coined the idea of Gaia for a scientific thesis, many people said, myth and science can't mix. But nothing has made Gaia more powerful than the mythic power of science, the mythic power of responsibility. And it's in this context that I want to propose, I think the Constitution has to be written in a literary sense to create the sense of the Anthropocene, which Father George was telling me about this morning. Because the Anthropocene is a new notion of morality, responsibility, ethics. It's a new notion of language. You call it ecosophy, but I could use other words for it. But the power of this is a group of vernacular dialects get together to create a wider sense of planetary, not global consciousness. Globalism is illiterate next to the planetary responsibility. And literature has to be planetary in responsibility. A Tolstoy is planetary. A Proust is planetary. A Gandhi is planetary. And I think we need that power of language to turn the Constitution from a national constitution and a nationalist constitution, because nationalism is illiterate today, into a planetary constitution. So the prospect is very clear before the first line. Turn literary and rescue the world. Or be practical and save yourself from arrest. I think in a deep and fundamental way, I think Vijayan was here today. He would be one of the great moral voices of the Anthropocene. Kazakh as a village would have blown into a planetary imagination. And maybe Kili would have been its new prophet. The mind boggles to see what Kazakh would have become within this new imagination. Thank you.